Hi, I'm Colin.
And I'm Phil.
We're the hosts of Science Fiction 101.
It's a show which gets to the heart of science fiction. Books, films, TV. We've covered Star Trek,
Doctor Who,
Star Wars.
We love to explore the past, present, and future of science fiction.
And we'd love for you to join us
on Science Fiction 101.
Hi, Colin.
Hey, Phil.
Here we are again, recording Science Fiction 101, and it's March 2024. And today, we're going to be getting down to some tough questions about what it means to be a science fiction fan. Later on, we have a quiz, and we have our usual saunter through our thoughts on past, present, and future science fiction. Before going any further, some news about the podcast. First, you may have noticed a slightly different beginning to the show. The real news, though, is that we hope to shortly be added to the roster of podcasts on the podcast radio platform in the UK. The other bit of housekeeping about the podcast is that we now have a regular feed of the podcast onto YouTube. In the past, I've manually uploaded episodes when I felt like it, and it's been a bit of a chore. But now YouTube allows us to have an automatic feed, so that will be there. So if anyone wants to listen to the podcast on YouTube, you'll be able to do that on a regular basis now. I hasten to add, it's audio only. We do not record video. Heaven forbid that we did that, because I don't know about you, I'm sitting here in my pyjamas. So it's audio only, but this is all because Google is trying to move people away from Google Podcasts, which is shutting down, and move them instead to YouTube. For some reason, it's their idea, not mine. But anyway, we'll give you a link in the show notes to that. Next, some responses from listeners. Andy wrote to say our last episode was an excellent episode, so thank you, Andy. He said he really enjoyed Robert J. Sawyer's The Downloaded and found it great fun, but he hadn't really noticed the constant increasing of science fiction tropes as the story developed, so he says maybe I'll not re-listen to it to avoid playing sci-fi bingo. He concurred with us that the quiz last time was pretty terrible. It was some online quiz and fairly basic. So Andy actually sent us a quiz, but it was so dreadfully fiendish that I don't dare use it. It's too hard. I didn't get very many answers right at all. So what we're going to try and do is make it a bit more palatable, a bit more doable, and then maybe use it for a future episode. But thanks, Andy, for your efforts on that. We also heard from Damo, and Damo, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Apologies if I'm not. Damo said, a great episode and a very interesting discussion of the book. I do enjoy seeing science fiction tropes build up, but not too many, as you discussed. And it was nice to hear a shout out for book clubs. So thanks to Damo for that. And then Sue said, I second the shout out for book clubs. I love my 3 very different ones. So no, I thought I was excessive going to 2, but Sue goes to 3. Sue says, I'm a Robert J. Sawyer fan and enjoyed hearing about The Downloaded, but highly recommend his extraordinary Flash Forward, brackets, the book only, from which I suspect that maybe Sue didn't like the TV series very much. But I love Flash Forward, both book and TV. The only thing I don't like about the TV series is that it just stopped. They should have had a proper ending to it. But no, I like Flash Forward. Sue also recommends Stefan Rudnicki as an audiobook narrator, and you can hear his readings on Lightspeed and elsewhere. And yeah, I've heard some of those, some very good stuff. And Sue, we were talking last time about Dune, the old one and the new one and the part 2 of the new one. And Sue says, just today I saw the 40-year-old Dune on the widescreen. Great cast, great music, and at times more of a collage than a straightforward film, but that added to the mystique and was only a little annoying. Bonus feature at the end with comments from effects directors who showed amazing models. So thank you, Sue. So we always like to hear from you, so please post your comments on Facebook, where you can find us as Science Fiction 101 Podcast, or on our blog, which is at 101sf.blogspot.com. Colin, have you seen Dune Part 2 yet?
I did. I went with my friends Seth and James a couple of weeks back.
Amazing. And do you think, without giving any spoilers, do you think the two films combined are a complete adaptation of the first book, Dune?
Recently, with adaptations, I've been seeing how knowledge of what you're going to do in the future allows you to change things in your adaptation so that the overall flow is smoother.
Right, yep.
So the ending of this movie is, Dune 2, is different from the book's actual ending because Denis Villeneuve knows he's going to make a third movie about this. And so he has tried to bridge this gap and make it a smoother adjustment.
Right, yeah. That's what I suspected. But I still haven't seen it, and I still haven't seen the first one. But I will make it my mission to watch both parts very, very soon. I saw that the Blu-ray for Dune 2 is coming very soon, so I will grab that and I will watch both films. And then we can talk about it.
Yeah, that would be great. We went to the RPX theater here for Regal Cinemas, which has the enhanced audio and it has rumble seats. So when they kick on the bass, I think they have bass boosters under every seat, which is great as long as the bass boosters on the left half of the seat and the right half of the seat are tuned correctly and matched in volume. So I was getting considerably more left cheek than right cheek in my bass boost. I eventually got used to it, but I felt like I was kind of listing off to one side.
Now, on to our main topic. And I've called this To Be a Fan.
To be a fan. I'm not a very engaged fan. You know, I like to read. I like to watch. I have a couple of podcasts. So I came up with this question. What do you have to see, read, listen to, or do in order to be a science fiction fan? And so I set this goal where I was going to literally run across the internet to all the places I could think of and try and talk to people in groups and see what they thought about that or variations along that. And I tried to ask it very neutrally. Yeah. So it didn't sound gatekeepery. Like I was asking people to validate my gatekeeping. Yeah. It was really soliciting opinions.
And I'm assuming you got some responses.
I talked to 2 Discord groups. I talked to Reddit. I talked to people on Twitter. I went and I talked to librarians at my local library. Yeah. All told, 20 to 25 people. Mm-hmm. And I have all their I have quotes from every single place, and it was fascinating the level of response that I got.
It would be good to hear some of those. So perhaps as we discuss it ourselves and sort of go through our own feelings and thoughts on the subject, maybe you can feed in some of the responses that are either in tune with what we're thinking or maybe contradict what we're thinking.
Oh, I'd love to, because the responses go from the flippant to the completely shocked that I would ask such a question, to some very, very deep dives and analyses, things I hadn't even considered as I was going through this. And so,
Excellent. So is there some set requirement? Is there any consensus on what it means to be a science fiction fan?
The general consensus from all these places that I went to is no.
Right.
And that varied from, no, you just have to consider yourself a science fiction fan, to, well, you should like some part of science fiction, which people talked about. People talked about writing songs. People talked about doing art, which is something I hadn't thought about.
Yeah.
So if you are, dreaming about planets and aliens or fantasy or AI, and you draw these things, and you don't do anything else other than just do drawings, you're still a science fiction fan because you're thinking about speculative things and doing them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And I've noticed that there are creative science fiction fans, and I don't mean that as a value judgment. I mean people who create things. But then there are the more passive consumers of science fiction, the people who just read the books, just watch films, and so on. And again, passive isn't a judgmental term there. It's simply a description of how people consume science fiction. So you've got the active and the passive.
Yeah.
What do you think about, just to move it slightly sideways, what about people who engage in science fiction criticism? So, for example, I do a little bit of academic work to do with science fiction. So I can be classed as a science fiction critic. And of course, on this podcast, we're reviewing science fiction. So we're critics of science fiction. Does that make us science fiction fans, or does that put us somehow outside of science fiction looking in? How does that sit?
Well, boy, it seems like if you were to be completely objective, it seems like you would have to be on the outside looking in at it. At the same time, if you're that removed from it, it would be hard to fully understand science fiction.
Yeah.
But again, we're talking about someone that consumes science fiction content at some level and is thinking about science fiction. A lot of people, their answers seem to come down to, it's what the fan considers.
Right.
One of the places I went to was Reddit. And I was really, really regretting this idea because Reddit communities sometimes have a reputation for being non-serious.
Right.
Let me say it that way. I mean, because there are some wonderful communities. I'm part of one for disc golf. There's a Reddit community for uplifting news, where that's all they share in the channel is just these cool stories that you see. So I went to the science fiction one. One of the people on there, their mom absolutely loves Star Trek. Totally loves Star Trek. Will randomly quote it through the day based on things she hears in other not related TV shows and things, but does not consider herself a science fiction fan. So, she's not a science fiction fan. She's a Star Trek fan.
Right.
And I think that spawned a long, big conversation about whether Star Trek was really science fiction or not, which is so science fiction fandom. We seem to spend so much time about, is this science fiction? Is this good science fiction? Is this bad science fiction?
It's another form of gatekeeping, though, isn't it? To say, Star Trek. Yeah, no, that's not real science fiction. It's setting up yet another gate. But for people who are into that branch of science fiction, it's every bit as good or as valid as those who are interested just in science fiction books. But then even within science fiction literature, you have people who appreciate it for the literature and people who appreciate it for the action and the adventure. So there are many different reasons for reading science fiction, just as there are many different reasons for watching it. And
there are so many subgenres that really...
Yeah.
It would almost be like telling someone who liked to watch Western movies that they weren't a movie fan.
Yes.
Right? So just because you like whatever in science fiction, whether you are a sci-fi poetry fan, that's not me, but I can't argue that science fiction poetry isn't written and that it isn't good, whether I like it or not. But that, like you were talking about earlier, that just goes to parts of science fiction culture or media that aren't my favorites. It doesn't disqualify them.
Yeah. So in terms of there being some set requirement, I think we're agreed, no, there is no really fixed requirement. You can call yourself a science fiction fan. Other people can point at you and say you're a science fiction fan. And really, it just needs to be based on the fact that you're interested in it or you like it. That's all, isn't it? There's no other requirement.
Yeah, there was some discussion, and this happened in several places, about you could just say you're a science fiction fan and know nothing about it, which means you're an uneducated, uninvolved science fiction fan.
Yeah.
And that went all the way to the other end. So again, back on Reddit, this one user, UnluckyCry6974, said, and I think this was tongue-in-cheek, they have to be able to spell Ursulus Lagrange. No. Ocelot language. No. Uhura legumes. Whatever the name of the author of The Left Hand of Darkness is.
Very good.
And that was about as gatekeepery as I came across.
So now I think you referred to this earlier, but I'm going to pose it as a formal question. Are there certain things that you have to have watched or read or listened to in order to count as a fan? Is there a kind of a checklist? And if you haven't seen those, sorry, no, you're not a science fiction fan. Not yet. Go away and watch season 12 of Doctor Who. And once you've done that, you're in. Is there a kind of a checklist? Are there certain things you must have seen?
Not really. No. My college friend Nisu Shah, I asked him this question, and I hadn't talked to Nisu in almost 15 years, and I found him met him again at Godzilla -1, the movie.
Oh, yeah.
And became Facebook friends. And so I reached out to him when I thought about this. And I said, hey, I got this question for you. And he goes, gatekeepers. Let me think about that. Great question. And then his response in full, I'd like not to have specific requirements, just an enjoyment. That being said, I'm a big fan of the classics. And then he listed this great big long list. He tended to like more older science fiction than newer science fiction.
Right, yeah.
And he ended that list with, those are things that come to mind as recommendations, not necessarily required.
Right. And that's getting to a number of different things. I mean, that's allowing for different tastes. It's also allowing for the differing age of people. I mean, I'm assuming that this friend of yours is probably around the same age as you. Mm-hmm. And obviously, if you talk to older people, significantly older than us, they will have grown up in a time before Star Wars, before Star Trek, probably before science fiction media. I mean, I'm talking about people in their 70s and 80s, probably grew up maybe with Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, but not much else in terms of visual media. But they would have grown up with books, possibly science fiction magazines. And then you come up to today, and most people's entry into science fiction is through film, TV, computer games, comics. Even if they do find themselves reading science fiction literature at some point, their entry point is something entirely different. And then on top of that, there's the where do your personal interests then take you? Now, for me, I started reading science fiction at a certain age, at a certain point in history. But what I found fascinating was the origins of science fiction. So once I discovered it, I found myself kind of going backwards and looking at older and older science fiction because I was curious as to where all this came from. But that's just my personal take on things, that I like to see origins and try and get an understanding of origins. Other people have no interest in where science fiction has come from, and they're only interested in where it's going. What's the next new thing?
Yeah.
So there are so many different answers to this, and it's impossible for anyone to have total comprehension of the whole field. Even the most dedicated scholar can only concentrate on a certain amount of this massive territory that we call science fiction, or the bigger territory that we call fantasy or speculative fiction.
Yeah. In this process, I kind of realized, because I would ask this question, and then most people would say, oh, no, there's no requirements. There were some flippant responses. There were some very thoughtful responses. But many, many times it devolved or evolved into a discussion of what every person liked. Well, this is what I like. This is what I like. Again, on that Reddit community, one of the people said, knowing which way the deck should be oriented on a spacecraft would be a good start. And then it became, everyone started talking about their own beef with that, about Slave One from Star Wars, about the Hail Mary from Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Yeah. And people would talk, well, it should be oriented this way because of gravity. But it was this great discussion about people sharing what they knew and then having that discussion with other people, which I think is the best possible reason why you should read things that you don't necessarily like. It's so that you can understand what other people are reading and liking, even if you don't like it, but then you can have a discussion about it.
I completely agree with that. And that's one of the reasons, just to go back to the book group idea, that's one of the reasons that I'm in a couple of book groups, is because I know what I get out of a book, but I want to know what other people's take on it is. Sometimes in a book group, we'll read a book and it's one that I just don't get. I think, well, I don't see the point of this book, but I'm very keen to hear what other people have to say because they will have gotten enormous amounts out of that book that to me is almost incomprehensible. And hearing them explain it will sometimes, not always, but sometimes it will unlock the book and there'll be a little aha moment. That's why this book works for people, but I missed that part of it, or I didn't concentrate when I was reading that chapter. And I guess that's where science fiction fandom comes from, isn't it? It's people getting together to discuss. People are not content just to read the books and watch the films. They actually want to talk about it with like-minded people, or even people who are not like-minded. And that's why we do a podcast. I've just realized.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're an academic who... Sometimes, who I think came into fandom, like you said, came into fandom because you liked it, and you're an expert on Ray Bradbury, but you read things outside of Ray Bradbury and really enjoy it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I was a completely casual fan who's always been a casual fan, now a podcaster. We come at things from different likes, different cultures, because, you know, we're on different continents. Yeah. And I think that's part of the fun. It's like, you know, do I like this because it just happens to be popular in the United States, or is it like universally accepted, or is it just me? Or
yeah.
One of the things about Project Hail Mary that I really liked is Rocky talked in music. And so that book was published during the pandemic, and I hadn't been able to perform music, I think at that point, for almost 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the middle of this pandemic and the isolation and the crazy things going on politically and culturally, I got a little bit of music back from science fiction, and that was really meaningful to me. So
fantastic. Yeah. I've got another question here, and it's something we have addressed. We did an episode about this fairly near the beginning of the podcast, and that is there a science fiction canon, and should there be a science fiction canon? Now, I can't remember what we concluded when we did that as a topic, but I think we almost certainly said no, that there isn't a science fiction canon, and there probably shouldn't be. But having things like a recommended reading list is not a bad thing. And that's something that I, as an academic, I don't teach science fiction really, but anything that I do teach, I always put together a reading list. You know, you always think about what are the foundational things that it would be good for students to expose themselves to while they're studying this topic. And so I think, you know, there should be things like a recommended reading list for science fiction, but it's not a canon as such, because again, that implies gatekeepers and some sense of central authority. What do you think? Is there a science fiction canon? Should there be?
Every group of people has a set of common language.
Yeah.
Like when I was talking about music, or if I talk about disc golf, there are certain things I can say which identify me to other people as, yeah, he kind of knows what he's doing about disc golf, whether I can throw 400 feet or 250 feet on a good day with a tailwind downhill. Even in science fiction, I think while there isn't a canon, people should kind of know the lingo. Like, you know, we can talk about Star Trek versus Star Wars or Doctor Who. We can drop author names.
Yeah.
The deeper you go in, you know, you might talk about, who was the most person who won a Hugo, and, you know, how did Hugos work, and what are the other awards? So I don't know that there's a like a canon or a required reading list. You can find recommended reading lists all over the place.
Yeah.
I found one for this from the New York Public Library, hoping that they would come and say, oh, well, you have to read this to be science fiction. And it more tended to be, do you want to read science fiction? Yes. Okay. What kind of things do you like? Because here are these books which will match the things that you might like in science fiction.
Yeah, that's a kind of curation going on there. And it's the kind of thing that something like Amazon will pretend to do for you, because Amazon will say, oh, you like Mary Robinette Kowal. Well, maybe you'll like this. And it'll come up with stuff that's nothing like Mary Robinette Kowal's books, but it's published as science fiction, and so they assume that you're going to like it because it's just driven by a bot. But a curated list put together by a librarian who knows what they're doing is going to be a lot more powerful. And I think any properly put together suggested reading list will not just allow people to stay within the narrow territory that they do like, but will encourage them to spread their wings a little. You know, so if you found this book a little bit challenging, here's another one that's even more challenging. So try that. So you're drawing people into out of their comfort zone a little bit, while at the same time reassuring them that there is some continuity between what they've known and this unknown that you're pointing them towards.
Yeah, that was the feedback I got from the Hillsborough librarians. So that question on Reddit, there are upvotes, right? If people like what you ask or what you say, you get upvoted. If people don't like it, it was downloaded. So even though there was this great discussion about, you know, what it takes to be a science fiction fan, which ranged from nothing to, well, you should at least read some science fiction or watch some science fiction. Mm-hmm. Somebody came, and enough people came, they downvoted my question all the way to 0.
Ah.
And when I initially started talking to the librarians in Hillsborough, there was a real strong guardedness. And so I had to take a step back and say, okay, well, I'm trying to be objective, but I'm not getting any responses. And so I explained the setup for all this. And then there was some engagement. It's like, well, I see what you're saying. Well, I consider myself a science fiction fan, but I don't like hard science fiction. And then they both kind of said, well, really what we do is try and, like you said, right, we know what the science fiction is in the library. We ask people what they like, and we try and direct them to various areas inside there. We don't try and gatekeep or, tell them they have to do this or they should stay away from that.
And of course, that's one of the tricky jobs of librarians. People think of a librarian as being somebody who puts the books back on the shelves in the right order and occasionally answer a question from somebody who can't find something. But the real job of a librarian is, in the first place, deciding what goes on those shelves. So there is a kind of a gatekeeping that goes on there, but I would call it curation rather than gatekeeping, because it's done with the best of intentions. So there's the curation of what goes on the shelves in the first place, but then there's the steering of people within that collection. I always find it a bit frustrating when a library doesn't have a good collection on a particular subject. Because I always think, there should be more books here. My local library, I haven't been in there for a number of years, but when I first moved to this area and went to the public library, I used to go there every week, and I would always come back with a big pile of books. And over time, you exhaust the books on the subjects you're interested in, so you come back with fewer and fewer books, or you go there less often. And there were certain topics that they didn't really have anything on. And I used to think, those damned librarians, they're not doing their job properly. But somebody is making an intelligent decision about what to put on the shelves, and then they're steering people within that collection. And that's good stuff. I don't think that's gatekeeping. I think that's curation.
Well, and they have to work inside certain limits.
Well, yes, of course, yeah.
Yeah, so they have a fixed budget that they have to work in, for example.
Yeah.
Or, here in the United States, there's such a large political divide that depending on what state you go to, certain topics within science fiction might not be allowed by local laws in the libraries or the schools.
Yeah.
I just saw a variation of the hockey stick graph from climate change, but it was for the number of book bans in the last 5 years. And it went from virtually nothing to thousands of them across the United States every year.
Shocking. Yeah. Over here, we're aware of this. We're so influenced by American media and social media that we're quite well aware of what's going on in the States. I wouldn't say that we're totally immune to it in the UK, but there's far less of that kind of thing going on, as far as we know. Shall we say? That's going to make me sound very conspiratorial, which I'm not. But as far as we know, things are done more in the public interest.
Yeah.
Anyway, going to the very idea of fandom, the idea of fans organising themselves, and doing conventions and clubs and meetings and that kind of thing. There's a couple of phrases which I've known about for years, and I think I've mentioned these on the podcast before, but I don't know if you're familiar with these. Are you familiar with firewall or fearwall and FEJAG? Are you familiar with those?
No.
They're just a couple of acronyms, or maybe they're initialisms. I'm not sure. Fandom is a way of life is firewall, FIAWOL. Fandom is a way of life, which is a term to describe people who absolutely build their lives around being a science fiction fan. So they're not necessarily building their lives around science fiction, but they might be building their life around going to conventions, going to meetings, going to author signings, going to all the latest films, buying all the latest books. So they're thoroughly committed, and their entire, shall we say, social life is built around science fiction fandom. And the contrasting one to that, fandom as a way of life, is FEJAG, which is fandom is just a goddamn hobby. And that's people who go to conventions or whatever and just do it as a hobby along with other hobbies that they may have, train spotting or bird watching or whatever. And I've always thought there should be at least one other option, which is that, I don't know what this would be, but it's something like fandom means nothing to me. So for me, because I don't go to conventions, I go to academic conferences, but mostly if I go to a conference, it's because I'm going to be speaking at the conference. I don't just go as an attendee of the conference, usually. But I don't do conventions because I'm not really interested in social gatherings and that kind of thing. The social aspect of science fiction has never particularly appealed to me. What I like about science fiction is reading it, watching it, listening to it, and talking about it with other people who are interested. But mass gatherings of anything just tend not to interest me. Now, does that stop me being a science fiction fan? No, it doesn't.
Not in the least.
But it means I'm not part of an organised fandom. What's your reaction to the idea of fandom as opposed to being just a fan?
I'm tempted to go all sociological and say it's, as we find people that have our similar interests and we talk about them, we develop things, and those things eventually morph into, at the small scale, discussion groups and book clubs, and at the large scale, world cons, and people find a way to, these things grow and grow and grow. And whether you go for the social aspect or the educational aspect, or whether you are a speaker or a vendor, or you just like organizing things, those are all, those can all be part of fandom.
Yeah. And again, that gets to the diversity angle of these things, that everybody likes to read different things, everybody likes to watch different things. Everybody's who is involved in any kind of organised fandom is in it for a different reason. Some of them are in it because they like to meet up with their friends once a year. Other people are in it because they like to be on a committee. Other people because they like to volunteer and assist in the day-to-day running of a convention. Other people see it as almost like a civic duty for the science fiction field because they can get involved in administering awards and that kind of thing. So every single person, well, maybe not every single person, but for the most part, people are in it for their own personal reasons, just as they're interested in science fiction of different types for their own personal reasons.
Now, what about people, like I'm guessing at the publishing houses, there are some people deeply steeped in science fiction that would not consider themselves fans.
Yeah.
How, and they have a strong influence on what's produced and how it's produced and everything else.
Yeah.
But again, they're not fans. I don't know.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Because there we do have some gatekeepers. Because whether we like it or not, for the most part, science fiction books, and the same goes for film and TV and computer games and all of that, but for the most part, the books we consume are things that are produced by publishing houses. I know there's a huge amount of self-publishing going on, but it's really a drop in the ocean compared to book publication for books that turn up in bookshops. So there we do have some gatekeepers, and for the most part they are unknown and anonymous to us. Most of us don't know who the editor is at HarperCollins, who looks after science fiction, who is the editor at Tor Books. So there are some anonymous gatekeepers. There have been times in the history of science fiction where book editors have become familiar figures. And sometimes you get people from within the field who are influential book editors. So I'm trying to think of some names now. Well, someone like Frederick Pohl, for instance, was a well-known author. but he was also a book editor. Lester Del Rey. These are people from kind of the golden age of science fiction.
Yeah.
So sometimes there are people in those positions who are science fiction fans, but for the most part, they are anonymous. If you pick up an album, a music album, it will tell you who produced it. Not just the artist, but who the producer was, who the recording engineer was. You go and see a film and you'll see these hundreds of credits roll by at the end. You pick up a book, it very rarely tells you who the editor is. At best, you get the name of the author, and sometimes you get the publisher's information, but it's very rare that it will tell you who the editor was. And I've always thought that a bit strange. Why are book editors so anonymous?
Yeah. You know, I got to vote in the I got to make Hugo contribution suggestions for the first time ever.
Yeah.
And there are so many categories, and some of them I felt completely unable to make suggestions because I had no idea.
Right.
I don't know how to separate the work of the author, for example, from the work of the editor. And for the most part, I don't even know the editors.
Yeah, that's right. I've just picked up a book that arrived at my house yesterday. It's a brand new book, and I'm just looking through it now to see if it names the editor, and it doesn't. There's no indication at all of who the editor is. It tells me who the cover designer was, and they give a credit to Shutterstock for some use of stock images.
Yeah. In the original Harry Potter books, in the very, very back, there was always a little blurb about what the typeface that was used in a nod to Mary Grand Prix, who had done that. And I'm like, I remember that, but no discussion of the editor.
It's weird, isn't it? We should have a campaign, try and get that sorted.
Yeah. I was trying to think of who would be someone like that in the modern day, and I want to say there's a friend of George R.R. Martin, who came up that way, was known as an author, but was more known for doing anthologies and editing.
Right, yeah.
But again, I'm completely blanking on his name, which is not what he deserves for his hard work.
I suppose anthologies are the exception, because anthologies usually do have a named editor, but it's a different role. The editor who edits an anthology is dedicated to that one book, but the editor of the science fiction line at, let's say, HarperCollins is somebody who has an overview of a range of books and decides which books to add to that line, as well as working with authors in developing new material. So those two types of editor are very different. The anthology editor is usually not anonymous, but the line, I don't know what they're called, the line editor who edits the whole line of science fiction books for a given publisher is usually not known to us. I suppose we can find out if we start reading journals from the field of publishing, but I haven't got time to read those. I'm too busy trying to read books.
Yes.
I'm conscious that we're going to run out of time soon, so are there any final thoughts that you want to give on this topic?
Mike Glyer, who I want to call out for, he was the first person I reached out to. I was very nervous about doing this because I didn't want to leave the topic unresearched, but I didn't feel qualified to go and do all these interviews, and online interviews don't always go very well.
Yeah.
He gave me this wonderful answer that I'd like to quote. So I asked him the question, what do you have to read, watch, listen to, or do to be a science fiction fan? And he goes, though not being much of a gatekeeper, I'd only say that to be a science fiction fan, you simply need to enjoy science fiction and read or watch it. Now, to be an active science fiction fan usually means getting connected to a fan community in some way, not just reading and watching. And there are all kinds of communities, whether in person like clubs and conventions or online and social media, fanzines, email listservs, or whatever. And one of the other acronyms in science fiction fandom is SMOF.
What's that one?
Secret Master of Fandom. And I became aware of it during the sad puppy scandal, because there was an accusation of these are the people behind the scenes that control the conventions and who can speak and which books are published.
Yeah.
If there was a SMOF, Mike Glyer would be there, because he has been publishing his news things since 1978.
Yeah.
And for him to say that there is no gatekeeping ought to kind of put an end to the whole subject, as far as I'm concerned. Let's do a quiz.
I have 10 questions here, and these are taken from a website called Quizbit. And maybe we've used Quizbit before, but I found some interesting questions here. I actually went through about 20 questions and boiled them down to about 10 because there were some that I thought were a bit not very good. But here are some. It's a mixture of easy and challenging.
Okay.
So let's just see how you do on these. Question 1. Who played the title role in the 1968 movie Barbarella?
That was Jane Fonda.
It was, correct. Question 2. Put these Star Wars episodes in chronological order. That's chronological order. A New Hope, The Last Jedi, Revenge of the Sith.
Now, chronological order, is that the order of release, or is that the order in the Star Wars timeline?
I think that's in the Star Wars timeline.
Okay, and let me get, there's A New Hope, Last Jedi, and what was the third one?
Revenge of the Sith.
Yeah, so that would be Revenge of the Sith, A New Hope, and Last Jedi.
Correct. Question 3. In Firefly, which character utters the iconic line, "I swear by my pretty floral bonnet I will end you"?
Oh, that's Captain Mal.
Okay, so you do know Firefly. Good.
Yeah, I would love to have seen what that happened, how it would have evolved over 2 or 4 or 5 seasons of show.
Yeah, me too. Question 4. What planet is Dune set on?
Arrakis.
Of course. Question 5. What is the name of the woman created by Wyatt and Gary in Weird Science?
Oh my goodness. I haven't watched that since the 90s,
No.
which should tell you something, because it was actually released in the 80s, so I watched it more than once. The actress was Kelly LeBrock, and I don't remember her character's name.
Well, you should get a bonus point for knowing the actor, but it was Lisa.
Lisa.
Yeah. Question 6. Where we're going, we don't need roads, is a quote from which 80s time travel movie?
Back to the Future, uttered by Dr. Emmett Brown.
Now, do you think it's Back to the Future, or do you think it's Back to the Future 2?
It's Back to the Future, the original.
Okay. It says here...
They say it...
It says here 2. But I
no, that is right.
It.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Okay, yeah, so I missed that one.
Question 7. Who plays Spock in the original series of Star Trek?
Leonard Nimoy.
Correct. Question 8. Which iconic sci-fi movie... I do hate that term. Which iconic science fiction movie, released in 1968, features a cast that includes Keir Dullea, Gary Lockwood, and William Sylvester?
That would be 2001.
Correct. Question 9. In Battlestar Galactica, who created the first Cylons?
Oh, we did. They did.
But can you put a name on they or we?
Oh.
Because there's a named individual here.
There is, and I don't remember it.
Apparently it's Daniel Greystone.
Daniel Greystone.
Yeah. I do have to confess I have not fact-checked these answers, so I do hope these are correct.
I would bet that's actually Battlestar Galactica, the second series.
Yeah,
versus the first series.
I imagine it was, yeah, but I don't know. More research is needed. Question 10, the final question. In which sci-fi movie do we see a former NASA pilot get sent through a wormhole in search of a new home for humanity when Earth becomes inhospitable?
Is that Interstellar?
It is, correct. So I think you got... There were 2 that you didn't get, and one where I think I said I'd give you like half a point for knowing the actor. So that means I think you got 7.5 out of 10, which is pretty good. So well done. That wasn't too bad, was it?
No, not bad at all.
So thank you, quizbit.com. And I'll put a link to the full quiz. I think there's about 50 questions in total. I'll put a link to that on our website, which is 101sf.blogspot.com. Now, how about some past, present and future?
Let's.
I've got a past item. It's only taken me 25 years, but I've finally got around to reading Darwin's Radio by Greg Bear, which won a Nebula in 1999, and I think it was Hugo nominated and nominated for some other awards. So it was a book that all those years ago I knew was there and I knew I wanted to read it, but for one reason or another I've just never read it until now. So I haven't finished it, but one of the book groups that I'm in is reading Darwin's Radio, so naturally I joined in with it. And it turns out to be somewhat different in style to what I was expecting. Do you know it? Have you read it?
I did read it, yeah.
Yeah. I'm only about halfway through, but I found it quite a slow build. There are like two stories, really, that run in parallel for a while. We sort of cut backwards and forwards between these two sets of events, and then eventually things begin to converge. And it's to do with DNA and retroviruses, and it's to do with, I'm trying not to do any spoilers, but it's to do with there being stuff in our DNA which basically is programming us for a future plague. And it's about what happens when this plague is activated. Now, as I say, I found this book a little bit sluggish compared to what I was expecting. And I don't think it's the fault of the book particularly. I think it's more to do with me as a reader. It seems to me that the book is constructed a bit like a movie because, as I say, it's got these two parallel stories initially, which then later converge. So it's constructed a bit like a movie, but it doesn't really have the pace of a movie. And so I think something's changed in the last 25 years that I've come to expect things to go a little bit faster. And, well, obviously media storytelling has speeded up in 25 years. So for me, the jury's still out whether this is a great book or whether it's just a good book, you know. But it's funny to have put something aside for so long, a quarter of a century, finally getting round to it. And it's not quite the book I was expecting it to be. But anyway, if you've never read it, it's worth picking up. Darwin's Radio by Greg Bear. There's also a sequel to it, but I don't know that I will bother with the sequel. Do you have another past item?
Nope, I'm ready to talk about the future, or the present.
Whoa. Hold your horses. Yeah, we've got to do the present first.
Yeah.
I've got one very small present item, and that is we keep oscillating, but right now we are at number 4 in FeedSpot's list of top UK sci-fi podcasts. We've sort of hovered around 5 or 6 for a while. We're now a clear number 4 in that top 20. So congratulations to us. But the main thing is thanks to all our listeners, and spread the word, folks. Get more people listening, and we'll climb to the top.
That's right.
What's your present item, Colin?
Northwest Con is going to be in Seattle, March 28th through 31st.
Right.
And since we were talking about sci-fi fandom, I thought it'd be good to do some promotion. It appears to be con season because I on File 770 and other places I see lots of cons being discussed. So think about getting outside your comfort zone if you're listening to us and go out and see what's out there. You might go and say, "Why in the world did I waste my life with that time?" Or you might say, "Wow, I never would have gotten that cool T-shirt if I hadn't come up here."
Yeah. Seattle isn't far from where you are, I take it.
No, I'm actually kind of thinking about going up there just as a quick one day where I would catch the early train out of Portland and then ride the light rail down from downtown Seattle to where the convention center is.
Yeah.
And checking it out, go around with some podcast business cards in my back pocket and talk to people. Who knows?
Yeah. Take a recorder and do some interviews while you're there.
Yeah, maybe.
What about future items?
Well, I have an item which kind of straddles the present and the future. So yesterday was March 14th.
Right.
Which is, colloquially Pi Day, 3/14.
Oh, yeah.
But I want to let people know that coming up is Tau Day. Now, for those of you that aren't deep into math, tau is 2 times pi. And so if you were into Pi Day, Tau Day is twice as good. You can have twice as many pies.
So that must be the 28th of June?
It is.
I've never heard of such a thing. Of course, Pi Day doesn't work in the UK because we do our dates the proper way round. We put the day first, followed by the month, followed by the year. So for us, it was 14/3/2024. So it's not Pi Day at all. But we understand the reference.
I guess it's just another one of those things the America has given the world to our backwards address handling.
Yeah. I've got a future item, and this is one of these things that may never come off, but I just thought I'd put a stake in the ground at the moment just to mark it. And that is that there's a production company in the UK called Route 24 who did a TV miniseries based on the Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham, which I still haven't seen. I must get around to watching that. But
and you call yourself a science fiction fan?
I know. Well, there are podcasts devoted to adapted science fiction that haven't even tackled it, so...
Oh, those slackers.
Yeah. But I read that they are now developing The Trouble with Lichen, which is another John Wyndham book. So I can only assume they're going to do the same thing, do like a 4 or 6 part miniseries or something like that. So that could be interesting. There have been multiple adaptations of the Midwich Cuckoos, but I don't think there's ever been any adaptation of The Trouble with Lichen, or some people say Lichen. I'm not sure which way you're supposed to pronounce it. But that would be really interesting to see. And it's a book that I've read once only, and I feel the need to read it again because I can't really remember what it's about, but I know it's quite good. And that also made me think, by the way, a note to future self, we should do a John Wyndham episode, because I don't think we've ever really talked about John Wyndham except in passing.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And there's a great, what looks like to be a great 1-hour documentary on YouTube about him, and it goes it's something about how he's one of the hidden gems or not well known authors of science fiction, and I think that's totally correct.
Yeah
We covered Day of the Triffids on my other podcast, David to Your Reader, where we do adapted, and the book is wonderful. It's a great book. It's very literate. It was engaging, but I liked it, really liked it.
Yeah, very good. So let's do more. Do you have any more future items?
Nope, that taps me out.
Well, then I think we've come to the end of the show. I was going to say the end of the road there, but that sounds a bit more final. So, thanks for listening, folks. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Kusky. Our theme tune is from Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com. Check out the show notes at 101sf.blogspot.com, and please give us a glowing 5-star review. I'll say that again. I always stumble on something in this end bit. And please give us a glowing 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever it is that you get your pods. And we'll see you next time.